Would you ask Mr. Davis to come back in, please? Secure.
Thank you.
Yes, do sit down, Mr. Davis. All right, ready to carry on?
Yes, yes.
Thank you very much. Yes, Mr. Kinnear.
Thanks, sir. Mr. Davis, could we go back to the document we were looking at before lunch, which is at FSF quadruple 0, excuse me, 0037/10. And if we could look at the penultimate paragraph in the right-hand column, it says this: there is undoubtedly an important role for industry-endorsed third-party certification schemes, but the schemes must themselves be fit for stated purpose and properly accredited. The optimum effect will only be achieved by officially mandating third-party independent schemes, or by receiving much wider specifier and client endorsement by insisting on third-party schemes to mitigate risks by specification. Did you read the report as calling for industry-endorsed third-party certification schemes for fire risk assessment?
Yes, yes.
What did you understand it to mean when it said that the optimum effect will only be achieved by officially mandating third-party independent schemes? Who should be officially mandating them?
Well, officially mandated means government. I think that's fairly self-explanatory. I should explain I wasn't involved in the sector at this time. I think this document predates me, doesn't it?
Mr. David, don't worry. I just want
to
put these documents to you.
Okay. But certainly my understanding of officially mandating, once we use the words mandating, we're talking of government legislation, either in primary or secondary legislation. The second part of it, the specifier endorsement and client, that's clearly where a client, a company, a business, a retailer would specify that they would only use third-party accredited people.
So effectively using procurement as the means of guaranteeing competency.
Yes.
Could we turn to page 11 of this report, where we find in the left-hand column a series of recommendations. And the first recommendation reads thus: there is no need for further legislation, however. The sector should lead on the application of knowledge linked to competency, certification, data sharing and awareness programs. The government should endorse this process and ask that part of the sector for a formal plan of action. So did you agree, or by that I mean the Federation, that the sector should, from 2010 onwards, lead on the application of knowledge linked to competency, certification, data sharing and awareness programs?
I certainly believe that was the aspiration at the time. It was ambitious, but that was the aspiration, and I should explain in context, industry tends to prefer third-party endorsed schemes rather than being told, legislated to do things.
And that's why you were keen, whilst it should be sector-led, nonetheless the government should endorse it.
Yes, yes.
Now, if we can go back to your first statement, which is at FSF quadruple 0 0036/4. And if we could look at paragraph 20 in the first line at the bottom, thank you. You explained that the group of fire sector interests which had produced Fire Futures reports had itself evolved through a loose fire community partnership into a more established fire sector partnership, which the Department for Communities and Local Government then invited to join in future work. And if we go over the page, associated with developing a new national framework for the fire service, which included a specific reference to national resilience and ensuring public safety against identified national risks. Can you help us at this stage? So we're talking at the time the Federation was inaugurated. What was the nature of the relationship between DCLG and the Federation? You touched upon it earlier, but can you give us a broader idea of what the nature of the relationship was?
I thought it was very close. As I say, I joined a little bit later, but I certainly had the impression from those that I was talking to, who were in this partnership, of course, at the time, Mr. Robinson as well, the government were very keen to see the sector formed into a federation, to take more ownership of the work, the guidance and so on, the national framework that was being established for the fire and rescue service, and that therefore they were quite keen to support it, help it establish itself.
Now, if we can stay in your statement but go on to page 8 and look at paragraph 32, and if we could look at the third line and second sentence, you were talking here about the objects of the Federation, and you said it also coordinates and promotes activities nationally and internationally to positively influence key decision makers. Pausing there, which key decision makers did you expect the Federation to be able to positively influence?
Well, nationally, it would be national government. So through the departments directly concerned with building regulations, fire safety, that would be fire and rescue service. Those would be the departments.
And what activities, or by what activities, would you seek positively to influence government?
The process quite often was that when a discussion was held, a letter maybe would be produced calling for action or support, or there'd be informal contact, as I mentioned, the fora. Before a forum, there was an executive committee, and in that executive committee, quite often the issues would be discussed. And I think I mentioned earlier, Anthony Maud was a link. He would often be there at those meetings. So there was a very strong connection between us and government in that context around fire, particularly.
Now, if we look at the final line of paragraph 32, there you refer to the Federation offering technical briefings. To whom would you offer those type of briefings, and can you give us an idea as to the range of subjects on which you provide advice?
Most of the technical briefings, I think, would be offered again to people working within the sector interests. So they'd be around the built environment primarily. They may be involved. One of our members, for example, National Fire Chiefs Council, now CFOA as it was then, we'd be working closely with them maybe on fire alarm, false alarms, trying to deal with technical issues around that. And that could, of course, involve the technical equipment side of it. Our members included the people who made, produced, installed alarm systems, and so on. So that engagement would very much be with the subsector of that interest.
Now, if I can move on to the separate topic, which is the structure of the Federation. Now, as you made the point emphatically before lunch that the Federation is a voluntary organisation, and those who conduct FSF business are not paid for their work. Is that a fair summary?
Yes, I mean, I'm called the executive officer, but I'm a part-timer. I'm paid for 2 days a week now, but that only started 4 years ago. At this time, primarily the support came from organisations like the Fire Protection Association, provided a secretariat. So virtually everyone, including myself, was in their work, doing their role, their job, and contributing to the Federation in their voluntary time.
Thank you. Now, if we stay in your statement, but go to page 23 and paragraph 94, we see here that, just fleshing out the detail on this point, that the Federation is a non-VAT registered company with no full-time employees, and as such it has very limited resources and capacity. From what you say, that's always been the case.
Yes, it has. I mean, the membership fee by subscription was relatively low. It's certainly not of the height of some professional bodies. And therefore, I think there's 50 members, just over 50 members, and as you can see, we're not hitting a VAT target. And there was no real income stream. In fact, apart from when we wanted to do something particular, that was usually done through partnership with some of our members who were particularly interested in that area of activity. And if I was to single out one, it would probably be the Fire Protection Association, who have been a continuous supporter over many years.
And is it right to say that at no time did you receive government funding?
I'm unaware totally of any government funding.
Just so that we get the personnel right, the chairman was Brian Robinson, is that right?
When it was formed, yes.
The deputy chairman was Paul Fuller?
Yes.
Vice chairman was yourself?
Yes.
And the treasurer was Ronnie King, about whom we heard earlier this morning.
That's right. Yeah.
Now, the work of the Federation was divided into work streams, and if we go to paragraph 34 of your first witness statement. That's at page 8, or at least the foot of page 8. Here you set out the various work streams. Is that right?
Yes,
And you led the Competency and Accreditation work stream.
that's correct. Yeah.
And if we turn over the page to page 9, we see that there was under little c, the second particular item there was a major incidents Lacknell House work stream, and that was chaired by Mike Wood. Is that right?
That's right. That's right.
And we don't need to go to it, but at paragraph 52 of this statement, you explained that the Lacknell House workstream was set up to address the specific issues that the coroner had identified as a result of the inquests.
That's correct. That's correct.
Now, if we look at paragraph 35 in your statement, which is at the moment at the bottom of the frame, in the first line you say this: in general, the membership of the workstreams was and remains open to all FSF members by self-selection. Now, if that's so, if self-selection was the mode by which this was done, how did the chairman ensure that the members with the appropriate expertise were working on the relevant workstream?
He would contact them. He'd invite them to participate. I think it's worth just saying that.
So, sorry to interrupt. So it's
Yes.
more nomination than selection, as it were.
Oh yeah.
Self-selection.
Arm twisting, in plain English. That I should just explain that it was quite organic, the growth at the beginning of the federation, because you're dealing with a voluntary organisation, people contributing their own time and effort. People with a particular interest would be the ones who say, I think this is an area we should cover, we should look at. And the tendency was to say, well, I agree with you. If you can form that grouping and find sufficient interest, then please do. And that's effectively, I think, what we're saying there.
Arm twisting is less effective on non-members. How did you get non-members involved if their expertise were considered to be helpful and relevant?
I think there is a passion, which maybe doesn't come through in my statement. There is a passion amongst a lot of people in fire to protect the public. That's where it comes from.
And did you ever encounter any problems persuading non-members to help your work? There are practical issues such as time available and the rest of it.
There are, very often, and that was the difficulty. I mean, for example, if you were trying to organise a meeting, just getting the people together was a major problem, finding a suitable date, getting to a place. I mean, it's interesting that as we move forward, and particularly with COVID, working online has eased some of those problems. But originally, when this was happening 10 years ago, just finding a room, agreeing a date, getting the agendas and getting people together wasn't an effort.
Now, staying in your first statement, can we go back to page 8 and look at paragraph 33? And here you explain that the original organisational structure was administered by an executive committee, which you referred to earlier, formed from elective federation officers and from those members appointed to advise the federation who were drawn from the chairs of its technical committees or work streams. Now, in very brief terms, Mr. Davis, what was the principal function or functions of the executive committee?
To steer the business of the federation, to give sight. There was a feedback loop. Our chairman particularly was meeting with others outside our group of interest, and the idea was to obviously bring that together in an executive to deal with the day-to-day management, to assess and give priority to where energy needed to be given.
And looking at the membership of the executive committee, can we go to, just to give a practical example, a set of minutes from the 1st of May 2013, which are at FSF quadruple 40244. And we see the attendees are listed there, and we can see on page 1, it's the left-hand side, about 10 or so names down, Anthony Maud from DCLG. Was Mr. Maud officially a member of the executive group meeting, or was he simply invited to attend all executive group meetings?
I would use the phrase observer.
And was the assumption that he would brief government on
Yes.
what you were doing?
Yes.
And do you know who within government he
No.
briefed?
I'm sorry, I don't.
We can also see from the list of apologies that Sir Ken Knight and Peter Holland, then the outgoing and incoming Chief Fire and Rescue Advisors, gave their apologies. Would the Chief Fire and Rescue Advisor routinely attend?
Sometimes. I can't recall exactly how often, but I mean the minutes will show. But I think that's a good example of what you asked me before, of the sort of people being invited to participate.
So grand observers in that regard.
I said yes, and of course they had knowledge from where they were coming from that could contribute and assist.
And was your expectation or assumption that the Chief Fire and Rescue Advisor, Mr. Maud, would discuss the Federation's deliberations with officials and ministers at the department?
It was an assumption, yes, but certainly a fair assumption, I think.
Was there ever a direct line of communication between the Federation and any particular fire minister?
There was correspondence.
That the minister wouldn't attend or send an official observer to represent him?
I'm thinking, not to represent the minister, no, but officials would occasionally attend to give a briefing or something of that ilk, depending what was happening.
Now, if we can go to the minutes of the Executive Group meeting of the 7th of March 2012, which are found at FSF quadruple 00239. Now, it's March 2012, so it's before the partnership became the Federation. And we can see that the membership is smaller, certainly compared to the last set of minutes we looked at. But was this executive group meeting similar to the Federation's later executive group meetings in terms of the attendees?
I think so, and as you say, it was smaller because we hadn't formed the Federation with all its work streams. And I think also it illustrates, if you look where it was held, that the support of government, that's a government building.
It's the department's headquarters, isn't it? And we can see that Mr. Maud attended, and we can also see there's a Graham Pointer attended from the department.
Yes.
And if we go to page 2 and item 4, we can see there was an update from Neil, or update on Neil O'Connor meeting. Who was Neil O'Connor?
Neil O'Connor was the director, I think,
of
DCLG Fire.
And we can see there the initial...
I might be wrong with that. I mean,
but that's
a high-ranking official within that department.
Okay. BR is presumably Brian Robinson,
yes.
the chairman. And there, following the initials, it says this at item 4, BR assured the group of the positive tone of the discussions which covered the FSP constitution, funding, business plan and national framework. Neil was wholly positive regarding the FSP, reiterating the support from government for SFP's endeavours to provide guidance on policy, and made assurances to Brian Robinson of continued support from DCLG. Now, if we can turn to the final paragraph in item 4, AM, so that's Anthony Maud, reiterated Brian Robinson's feedback and added that access to other key contacts within government departments would be possible, a gateway to the right people in the right places. Now, do you know who those key contacts were intended to be?
I don't. I wasn't that close to it then, no.
Now, can I turn to the Competency and Accreditation Workstream itself? First of all, can you remember when you were appointed the chairman of that workstream?
Around the April time, I think.
April of which year?
2012, was it? Yeah, I think so. Or 2013. 13, wasn't it?
More likely 13.
Yes, 13 it was. I was thinking 12 was when I became a vice chairman, but the work stream didn't really form till the following year as Justice Kirkham was preparing the outcome of Lakenhall House.
And she sent her letters to some interested parties at the end of March 2013.
Yes.
So I suspect...
It's April that year.
April 20. Now, can you help us? Who were the members of your work stream?
I would need to look at the minutes, but there were certainly people like FPA, IFE. In other words, the bodies that were starting to get into fire risk assessment. There were people, I think, BAFE, BAFE, which is again one of our members. So it was that group of people who had been in the FIA, people who'd been involved in the FRAC document, which I think you've referred to earlier, the criteria. It was that sort of grouping. I think I tried to invite the previous chairman, Ian Cox, people who had obviously been involved in the original development.
And was Anthony Maud or any other representative of the department an invitee to Workstream meetings?
No, there weren't particularly invitees, but I think the way we worked is if there was a meeting happening, I mean, you would be alerted that a meeting might be happening, and if you wanted to attend, you certainly wouldn't be prevented.
So it's an open invitation?
Yes, an open invitation.
And how regular did you meet?
Initially, I think we met in the April, as you say. Then we met subsequently to that year. We made a report. I gave a document, a chronological document, to try and assist the inquiry. I think if you look at that, it'll give you a better feeling.
Okay, so it was quarterly or thereabouts.
I think sometimes it may have expanded beyond that, but yes, that was the intent.
Now, we'll come to the detail of the work in due course, but you were required to build upon the work that had already been done by the Fire Risk Assessment Competency Council. Is that a fair summary?
In part, we came together effectively because you mentioned Ronnie King and people like that before. We knew the Lakanal House coroner was going to raise certain issues. So the group formed in advance, I think, of the coroner's letter.
Were you ever a member of the Competency Council?
No.
Was there... And so when you were effectively given the heads up that the coroner was going to be looking at the competency of fire risk assessors, did you have a more precise idea of the scope of the issue that concerned her, or was it more broadly drawn as competency of fire risk assessors?
It was broad, and until the letter arrived, the key issues she was concerned with hadn't really come across. And I think it's important to put it in context as well. There were two issues on the go, really. There was a long-standing concern about the built environment. We've touched very briefly on that, and the fire risk assessment. And the two things sit together, and I think this is quite important. No amount of good fire assessment work will necessarily correct a poor building. The design of that building is the building regulation, the ADB, and so on. And therefore, we needed to bring the two things together. And the emphasis, therefore, on my work was to look at the fire risk assessment side of the business, whereas other people were starting already to look at the built environment side. And particularly, to put it in, a little context, one of the issues clearly raised was compartmentation, which internally a fire risk assessor might spot, depending on how intrusive the work needed to be. By which I mean, for example, if it was lifting a ceiling...
Mr Davis, I'm sorry to interrupt you. I think we're probably straying into matters which we'll cover due course. I'm just trying to establish essentials of really what work you were building on. And could we go back to your first witness statement, which is a FSF quadruple 00036/26. And if we could look at paragraph 104... you say that the FSF subsequently assumed responsibility for the FRAC documents.
Yes.
At the request of Ian Cox in 2015 after a review of activities. Is that a fair summary?
Yes.
And so what work had FRAC done beyond the various competency criteria that you were asked to build on?
Well, we were asked to review it. The idea was that clearly, having written the document and issued the document 2011,
yes.
The idea was that we should review, our own principle was that you should review these things at least within 5 years. So the argument was we should be reviewing the FRAC document.
Okay. Now, could we turn to a report that you prepared for discussion at a forum meeting in May 2013, which can be found at HOM quadruple 01351. And if we could go to page 5 of that. Thank you. Now, this is generally concerned with competency of fire risk assessors, and halfway down this page, there's a sentence which starts with the word subsequently, and which reads as follows. Subsequently, the FSF at the forum meeting 9th of January 2013, item 8.2, members had been requested by David Smith on behalf of the Competency Council to agree to assume the role of guardian to provide ongoing support in the form of monitoring events to determine whether the Competency Council needed to be reconvened to consider or respond to events not being a standing committee. This request was agreed, and a decision made to form a work group for that purpose. Do you recall that happening in January 2013?
Yes, yes.
So is it right that while formal responsibility for the guides was transferred in 2015, the FSF became guardian of those guides earlier in January 2013 and was responsible for reconvening the Competency Council if and when required?
Yes.
What was the reason for the Federation becoming the guardian of these documents in January 2013?
I think when David raised the issue, it was simply that it seemed the logical place for it to be done, because many members of the original FRAX group were in fact members of the Federation.
Understood. Now, can we turn to Lacknell House itself and the fire which took place on the 3rd of July 2009? The coroner wrote to the Federation on the 30th of March 2013, and the letter can be found at HOM 0004356. I'm assuming, but shout if this is not correct, that you are very familiar with this letter.
Yes, I've seen this. Yes.
Now, it's addressed to Mr. Robinson as the chairman. As vice chairman, did you see it when it was received?
It would have been circulated, I think, fairly quickly.
Now, if we can look at the foot of page 1, the coroner said this in the last paragraph on that page. Evidence adduced at these inquests indicated that fire brigades generally assume that compartmentation of individual flats or maisonettes in high-rise residential buildings would prevent the spread of fire from one dwelling to others or to common parts. However, turning over the page, evidence also indicated that particularly with older housing stock, compartmentation might be breached as a consequence of, for example, maintenance or refurbishment work undertaken by building owners or modification to individual dwellings undertaken by occupiers. Now, in short, were you aware of those issues before the coroner highlighted them in her letter?
Yes, I think so.
The letter continues, and we're looking at the second paragraph on page 2, thus. Evidence was also given that a fire risk assessor should inspect individual flats or maisonettes within a high-rise residential building to be able to inspect any features which could be seen inside, but not outside, the flat or maisonette, and which might indicate that compartmentation had been breached. I understand your federation seeks to give voice to and exert influence in shaping future policy and strategy related to the UK fire sector. Now, was that a fair summary of the Federation's aims at that time?
Sorry, which is the aim that you...
I understand your Federation seeks to give voice to.
Yes.
Now, it continues, thus, I also understand that the Fire Risk Assessment Competency Council, the Council, works within your Federation. My attention has been drawn to the Council's guides, competency criteria for fire risk assessors, published on the 21st of November 2011, and choosing a competent fire risk assessor, published on the 1st of February 2013. These indicate that your Federation is able to offer guidance as to some aspects of fire risk assessment. Did you agree at the time that the Federation was able to offer guidance to the extent summarised by the coroner?
Yes.
And if we could look at the penultimate paragraph of this letter, which says this, it appears that your Federation is well placed to shape policy at a national level relating to the scope of fire risk assessment, and in particular with regard to the assessment of high-rise residential buildings, and to offer guidance as to how assessment should be carried out. I trust that your Federation will consider whether it has a role in clarifying the scope of fire risk assessment and in offering further guidance as to the training of fire risk assessors. Was it your view at the time that the Federation could shape policy at the national level regarding the scope of fire risk assessment, to offer guidance on how to carry out assessments, and to offer guidance on the training of fire risk assessors?
I think we felt we could certainly influence those things as it's expressed there.
Can we look at FSF quadruple 0199? Now, this is a summary note of a meeting of the Lacknell House Workstream on the 30th of April 2013. And if we look roughly halfway down under the heading Context, there's a note which says this: Competency Workstream also formed, led by Dennis Davis, to build on the core principles from the Competency Council and take on the details of competency development. Was that why your workstream was set up?
Yes, yes.
And it relates specifically to the development of competency of fire risk assessors?
Yes, to try and address the coroner's request.
Now, if we can look at two documents that predate this meeting, the first is a HOM quadruple 0302. As you see, this is a document which we saw this morning, which you may have noticed, entitled Initial Evaluation of the Effectiveness of the Regulatory Reform Fire Safety Order 2005. If we can go to the bottom of page 4, we can see it was published by the Department for Communities and Local Government in March 2009. Again, can I assume that you've seen this document before?
I will have done, yes.
Do you remember how you came across it?
General interest, I don't think particularly searching for it.
Can we turn to page 43? We see here the title, FRA's Views of Third-Party Safety Consultants. Now, FRAs are fire and rescue authorities in this document. And if we go to the end of this page, the final paragraph says this: Some FRAs described concerns they felt over the work of third-party consultants or other commercial fire safety organisations. The central problem they raised was the variability in the perceived level of competence among these consultants. Was those concerns at least something about which you were aware at the time?
I was aware, yeah.
And would you have been aware at the time of publication of this document in or about March 2009?
Yes, I would.
If we can go to page 46 and look at the second paragraph on that page, it says this: While the FRAs recognised and welcomed the existence and development of registers of quality-assured fire safety services, several said that a national scheme of accreditation or licensing would be helpful and preferable. Were you aware in March 2009 or thereabouts that there had been registers of quality-assured fire safety services developed?
Yes.
Can you help us? What were they and who developed them?
We mentioned that a couple of our members, the institutions, had established their own registers. Institution of Fire Engineers, I think, had established a register by 2010. The FIA, through some of its organisations, had started to build schemes. Primarily, I think, it's the timing of this I'm just not too sure about. UCAS accredited schemes were primarily led by two organisations, BAFE, who I've already mentioned, and Warrington Fire Testing, I think, was another organisation. And they were UCAS accredited schemes. And they had started to build these schemes as a way of giving third-party assurance to fire risk assessors.
Thank you. Were you aware also at the time that there was appetite, at least on the part of some fire and rescue authorities, for a national scheme
Yes.
of accreditation or licensing?
Yes.
Are you able to give the panel about how widespread and deep that appetite was on the part of fire and rescue authorities?
I'd certainly, as I say, I was in FOBFO, wasn't I think, as part of this time. So I was aware that fire and rescue services were concerned about the quality of some fire risk assessments. I mean, there was a suggestion, for example, that anyone, and I mean anyone, could call themselves a fire risk assessor and go out and sell fire risk assessments. And that clearly worried fire and rescue authorities and their services. And I equally think that within a few of us, and you ask for a level, that's very difficult for me to say that. But there was certainly a drive from, and I was one of them, a drive from some people to ensure that there was a national register, really, that we brought this into one place.
Now, if we can, just for the sake of completeness, look at the bottom of this page and really the text under paragraph 3.10, we see identified there areas for future support or improvement. And the final bullet point at the bottom of this page is one which says this: the desire for better regulation or accreditation of third-party fire safety companies. Put bluntly, and this I think reflects what you've just said, fire and rescue authorities were looking for more effective regulation of fire risk assessors as well as others in the fire safety sector.
Yes, I think the general call was people wanted that assurance. They wanted to know that this person was, if they'd invited them, because go back to where we were when the order came in, no consultant's charter, you could do it yourself if it was a very simple premises. But if you were obviously moving into more complex buildings and complex area, you certainly wanted assurance that the people you were contracting to support you were competent. And the only way of doing that was through some process. And I think that's what this is reflecting.
And the market was looking for a third-party independent provider of that assurance, whether it's UCAS or someone else.
Yes.
Now, if we just turn over the page to page 47, we see that it's a start of a new chapter, which is the perceptions and experience of responsible persons. If we can go deeper into this chapter, though, to page 74, and it's really just below the midway point on the page, the text reads this: several organisations, both SMEs, that's small and medium-sized enterprises, and larger, had direct experience of using more than one supplier for risk assessments and were in a position to compare their work. They reported wide variations in the outputs, even when comparing the work of different personnel from the same organisation. Does that reflect your experience, whether through anecdotal knowledge or otherwise, of the variability in the performance of risk assessors at the time?
Those comments were certainly being made. So that wouldn't surprise me, let me put it that way. The problem is I have no idea of how deep and widespread this consultation and that depth was. But it's certainly those noises were around about variability, quality.
And then we have a quotation. And then after that quotation, the text says this: several responsible persons, and some of those interviewed from fire safety industry, registered a concern over that wide variation in the quality and competence of those offering fire risk assessment services. That, again, seems to reflect your understanding of, if I can put it, noise in the industry.
Yeah, that resonates, certainly. Yes.
Now, the second document I'd like to take you to is the first version of the competency criteria that were published by the Competency Council on the 21st of December 2011. Now, we find these at HOM 000 3347. And if we could look at page 2 and the 5th paragraph on that page. It says this: some members of the business community have suggested that it would be helpful for those who want to use the services of a commercial fire risk assessor to be able to access information on those with an appropriate level of competency in fire risk assessment to help them comply with the legislation. There has also been growing concern regarding the competence of those who provide these fire risk assessments on a commercial basis, i.e. for a fee. Data from the English Fire and Rescue Service suggests that the main compliance failure leading to enforcement action is a failure by duty holders to carry out a suitable and sufficient fire risk assessment. This is coupled with the emergence of inadequate fire risk assessments for premises that have suffered multiple fatality fires. Now, did that reflect your views and experience at the time?
Could I just pause for 2 seconds? I've spilled some water. No,
Oh, yeah, we'll give you a hand. Don't worry.
please.
Don't worry. It's usually
I
barristers
just
who
caught
do
this
that.
light, thank you. This light cup. It was a distraction, I'm sorry.
Don't worry.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Could you just redirect me back to the...
Of course.
Please.
If I'll just ask you to, rather than force people to listen to me, you'll see that paragraph which starts with the word "some members of the business community." If you can just read that to yourself.
Okay.
Now, did that reflect your views and experience at the
Yes.
time?
Yes.
So what we seem to have, therefore, is by December 2011, a general concern within the industry that the competency of fire risk assessors needed to be addressed. Is that a fair summary?
Yes.
And it sought to be addressed by publishing the competency criteria for fire risk assessors.
Yes.
And would you agree that the publication of the LGA guide on purpose-built blocks of flats in July 2011, and then the later publication of PAS 79 2012 in August 2012, was also intended to assist fire risk assessors on how to carry out a proper fire risk assessment?
Proper being competent.
Yes.
Yes.
Now, what happened to the earlier proposal that there should be a national scheme of accreditation or licensing?
I don't know where it went.
But it didn't proceed.
It didn't appear, no. And I think one of the documents you referred to, choosing a fire risk assessor, lists the scheme in its annex that did exist.
Okay. Now, were you or any other group in the Federation able to judge whether the publication of this suite of documents, so the competency criteria, the guide to choosing a fire risk assessor, the LGA guide and PAS 79, had successfully addressed what appear to be historical concerns about competency of fire risk assessors?
Two issues emerge for me. Yes, to your broad question, because what we were doing was professionalising fire risk assessment. So you had now a criteria, you had a guide, particularly in one sort of premises. There were, of course, DCL guides, 13 of them already in existence for other premises, but so there was a local authority guide, purpose-built flats, and we were moving therefore to, and with PAS 79, a methodology. So you were actually creating some of the key elements you need. In other words, you were creating a methodology, a criteria. What you hadn't necessarily got assessment of was skill, which is a key component, or behaviour. But you were certainly bringing those elements together. And what you also hadn't got was a complete oversight of how all that fixed together for one group of assessors. And this is very important. The group of assessors that we're talking about in this context, in the main, were often the people who were on those schemes. Whereas in the marketplace, there were hundreds of assessors who were not necessarily on those schemes.
So you'd made a start, but the job was not yet complete.
Yes.
Now, if we can go back to the Lacknell House Workstream note from the meeting on the 30th of April 2013, which was at FSF 0000199, and you'll remember the note under the heading context, roughly halfway down that first page. Now, despite the suite of documents, you probably answered this already, but I'll put it to you, despite the suite of documents that have been published to deal with the concerns about competency, why did you come to the view that the Federation needed to do further work on competency development?
To answer pretty well what I've just said, that it was to get this overarching view, because the problem was you were starting to create the elements, but to bring them together really cohesively so that they would work effectively, you did need another layer of control and interest, or however you want to put it.
Now, if we can look at the work of the Workstream itself,
Yes.
and its members first met on the 12th of April 2013 to discuss scope of work, the coroner's letter, and to propose a way forward. Now, that meeting considered a report which we will now go to, which is a HOM quadruple 01351, and we touched upon this earlier. If we go to page 5. And you'll remember this from, I think, a few moments ago, we see in the second paragraph, the second sentence, a reference to a meeting held on the 12th of April 2012. I'm assuming, sorry, this is a really minor point, I'm assuming that's a typographical error, and it should be Friday the 12th of April 2013.
Yes, yes. Right.
Now, the very top of this page is headed Fire Sector Federation Certification and Accreditation Workstream. Was that the same as the Competency and Accreditation Workstream?
It is. The name changed, but it is, yes.
But
and it's
so-
changed again.
So different labels, same
Yes.
work.
Same work.
Now, if we could turn to page 6 and see the heading there, Competency Criteria for Fire Risk Assessors. It says this: the existing CCFRA criteria were considered relevant but desirable of extension as follows. Now, I'm assuming that's a reference there to the competency criteria.
Yes.
Now, paragraph 3, it says this: there was an absence in the CCFRA of reference to risks posed by modification and refurbishment. This could be a new section or subdivision of the existing 9 sections. Now, was that view reached after collective discussion?
Yes.
Now, if we turn next to paragraph 4, a greater emphasis on the risks posed by the introduction of new materials, building design, modern engineering practice, and building methods was required, part of H1. Now, were external cladding panels specifically considered as part of that particular conclusion?
I think not specifically, but generally. The concern of new materials generally in design, modern methods of construction and we still call them, although they're conventional now, it's how we build buildings. There was a shift in emphasis over probably 2 decades. We've gone from very prescriptive standards of building control, I'm talking about, to functional. And the role of the compartment, which was very integral to our thinking in fire safety terms, was starting to evolve. So atria were appearing in new buildings, and buildings themselves were becoming much more open, and you didn't see barriers and boundaries in the same way, which is what we want as the public. But that gave rise to innovations, materials, changes. Insulation was becoming already then an important factor. Energy efficiency was starting. So the concern was that we were losing pace with the innovation of the industry. The construction industry is very innovative.
And put differently, there's no reason to suppose that external cladding panels were excluded.
Absolutely not. No.
Now, if we could look at paragraph 5, it said this: the importance of gaining access into individual premises rather than just to common areas to be incorporated, highlighting how compartmentation could be weakened by occupiers. Presumably, it was important for fire risk assessors to gain access to individual premises. Is that what is meant?
Absolutely. There was a legal argument, for example, about a dwelling door.
I think that may still persist.
Yes,
but
and clearly the compartment is totally dependent on the quality of that door.
and so what
If you can't see both sides,
and so you're aiming to avoid the consequences of a legally arid point.
yes.
Did the group discuss any particular aspects of compartmentation that could be weakened by the activities of occupiers?
I mean, the common sort of discussion would be about people unknowingly drilling holes through compartment walls. You know, I don't want to blame any particular company, but television companies putting cables through, or a general lack of awareness within all sorts of industries.
But presumably flat entrance doors would be of prime importance for the reasons you've just touched on.
Yes, the occupier deciding she didn't like the look, and I'm sorry, to put it that way, of the door and wanted it changing, but didn't realise the door was an integral part of the compartment.
For example, taking off things like self-closing devices.
Correct, yeah, or altering the ironmongery or things like that, which would weaken the door.
Now, if we can look at the bottom of page 6, there's a heading that says Execution of Fire Risk Assessment and Purpose-Built Flats. And at paragraph 1 underneath that heading, it says this: the 2011 Local Government Group Fire Safety and Purpose-Built Blocks of Flats Guide offered a substantial start in addressing the fire issues in high-rise residential property. It should be reviewed, incorporated and promoted for use as additional guidance on high-rise residential premises. Why did the group think it needed to be reviewed, incorporated and promoted?
I think it was accepted that it was a very good guide. It wasn't particularly well known, and the idea was therefore it should be drawn into the orbit of fire risk assessment for these particular type of premises and promoted as such.
Do you know why the LGA guide was not updated?
No, I don't. No.
Now, if we could turn over the page to page 7, under the heading Competency and Assessment, the document says this: the FSF was not to be seen as a third-party competency council, but did have, as the coroner put it, national influence, and, as such, should act as the guardian of the gold standard. Therefore, the objective should be to create a quality assurance board charged with ensuring the parties, such as those who are signatory to the CCFRA, abide by their commitment and introduce processes to enable their risk assessors to clearly demonstrate competency. Now, underneath that paragraph, we can see there are 11 points. I'd like to ask you about the second and third. The second says this: FSF should recommend to each certification scheme owner in the CCFRA that their scheme offer specific recognition against each of the existing 9 areas covered in the CCFRA, that the individual assessor is judged competent, and this would be known as a passport. 3, that each passport scheme should also offer a graded level of competency in each area from 1 to 3, where 3 is the highest in each level, reflecting skills and understanding. In summary, why did the group consider that the passport scheme should be recommended?
I think it goes back to your questions around National Register as well. It was about to ensure that quality assurance, as it mentions, could be demonstrated, could be shown. And without some overarching arrangement, and this was the suggestion being made, it was going to be very difficult to show that the elements had been pulled together. They would still be living in their individual pockets.
Would the passport scheme, though, only capture those who are already registered under existing certification schemes, and it wouldn't cover uncertificated fire risk assessors?
Yes, yes.
And that would be the big gap in regulation of the market?
Absolutely, but one took the view that you have to start somewhere.
How would you fill that regulatory gap? How do you ensure the regulation of uncertified fire risk assessors? It can only be by government mandate, i.e. legislation or regulation.
Yes, I use a very simple analogy. MOT testing of a car. There is a mandate of vehicles of certain age must have this test. There are approved centres where this test can be carried out, and there is a regime, which is the test itself, a standard. I think what we were trying to say was that we'd got elements of this, but we hadn't got it lined up at all in that way, and only by having that sort of solid link can you really assure that something as important as fire safety would be assured. I think that's where we were going, recognising that industry was already trying to create this assurance process through third-party assessment.
Now, the report from your meeting, which we've just been discussing, was discussed by the Federation's Executive Group meeting on the 1st of May 2013.
Yes.
And if we go to the minutes of that meeting, which we find at FSF *00244, and we can see at the top of the first page in the right-hand column, you sent your apologies, but presumably you read the minutes afterwards.
I did.
Now, if we can go to the bottom of page 2, we see the heading Lacknell House Update. And there it says, Paul Fuller, that's PF, explained that a Lacknell House workstream had been agreed, and this would be led by Mike Wood to address the specifics from the coroner's letter, answering the Rule 43 letter, and to move the sector forward. MW, that's Mike Wood, noted that the role of the FSF was clearly recognised in the coroner's letter, and that 2 main areas would be addressed within the workstream. 1, prime objective is to address the coroner's letter, which is likely to be specific around fire risk assessment in high-rise, and this is being addressed through a separate workstream headed by Dennis Davis. 2, secondary is to look at the wider issues and systemic failures. Mike Wood highlighted the sensitive nature and information in the public domain, but would be guided by the coroner's letter and the copy sent to other parties. Can you help us? What were the wider issues and systemic failures concerning fire risk assessments that the meeting minutes were referring to?
I think just below there's 1 to 4 there is some of it. The deep concern was that going back to the built environment and the building regulations and the process of how materials were being used, there was a concern that you could have a product, a component, and it could be introduced into a building and form part of a system, but the coherence of the whole product to how it's actually then installed and used within the system was not necessarily tested as a whole or seen as a whole, so you could mismatch and the performance would not work well, and that could only be addressed really by approved document B. The integrated fire safety management really was this ability for an occupier, because this is a refurbished building, which are often of the greatest concern, didn't understand the strategy by which that building had been designed and built to meet its fire safety requirements, and therefore could do things or not maintain things that needed to be done. The guidance itself, and particularly some of the built environment guidance, was itself difficult to understand, particularly for a layperson, but some of the technical language, as I recall, some of our people had debates about what it actually meant. It was interpretation because it was functional. So there were a few issues, yes.
Now, if we turn over the page, the bottom of page 3, we see workstream chair updates at the very bottom of the page, and we see there PT, who I think was Phil Toes of BAFE, commented on the circulated paper from you and suggested there was no requirement to reinvent the wheel, with the paper providing no mention of existing schemes such as SP 205 by BAFE. Now, first of all, what does BAFE stand for?
British Approval for Fire Equipment, but BAFE is actually a much broader organisation that gives approval schemes, UCAS approval schemes. And one of them, SP 205, is their Life Safety Fire Risk Assessment Scheme.
That's useful, because that answers my next question, so thank you. Now, if we look over the page at the top of page 4, we see that AM, who's Anthony Maud, commented that there was some concern from DCLG on the criteria and Competency Council work, as it looks like the proposal is to review elements which have only just been agreed following recent discussions. There is concern on the LGA work and guidance, and DD document mentions reviewing this, with DCLG confirming that additional guidance is not required. And then finally at the bottom we have in red and emboldened PF, so that's Paul Fuller, suggested that PT, so Phil Toes, and LC, who I think is Louise Craig, and DD, yes, i.e. you, meet to discuss the paper and suggestions in more detail. Now, did you meet Mr. Toes or Miss Craig thereafter to discuss your report?
You know, I don't think we did. I can't recall having a meeting or making a note of a meeting.
Now, following on from that, could we look at CLG quadruple 0526 on the bottom of page 1? There's an email there, as we can see, dated the 29th of April 2013, timed at 0908, from Louise Upton, who was an official in Fire Safety Department at CLG, and Brian Martin, who was in the Building Regulations Department, and Sir Ken Knight, as well as copy to others, which began thus: "Thanks for sight of this and happy to discuss. There are lots of positive here, and it seems the FSF are very keen to grasp the opportunity to own and develop the risk assessor standard." Now, above that email, you'll see one from Brian Martin, sent also on the 29th of April, but at 9:36 a.m. And he says this: "Looks to me like the FSF is in danger of trying to do more than is necessary, desirable, or within its ability. But I'm always having these negative thoughts, so maybe I'll just let them get on with it." And then finally, at the top of the page, we see Sir Ken Knight's response, which was, "Brian, I agree." Now, were you aware of those views at the time, communicated either by Mr. Maud or someone else?
No, I was not at no, I wasn't. And I wasn't at that meeting, as you say. I sent my apologies. I was working abroad at the time, I think. And when I read the note, I was quite disappointed. Only in the sense that we'd had a meeting which, to be fair, was a relatively small group. I think it was 5 or 6 people, that initial meeting. It wasn't a big meeting. And we were trying to scope what we thought was going to be necessary to address the issue. And that's what I put forward to the executive and to the forum to get agreed. And clearly that was rejected. It was almost like, we've done all this work, there's no need to go over this again. And I can understand why. I mean, 2011
But if I can
was the end of the FRAC, wasn't it? They'd only just published the FRAC.
But were you aware of the views?
Oh, certainly not of these views. No.
Had you ever had a conversation with Ken Knight where he gave you any grounds to believe that that's their view?
The only way I became aware
Sorry, if you
of...
could just
sorry.
Just let me finish the question. Had you had any discussions with Brian Martin ever?
I've had discussions with Brian Martin, but not about this.
And he never gave you any impression or gave any indication to believe that they felt you were overreaching, put differently?
Not at this time, no. No.
Now, if we can turn to the next document in the same email chain, it's in a separate document though, CLG 0000527. We see at the bottom of that page, it was a supplementary email that Sir Ken sent following the email exchange we've just looked at. And it said this: "Just to add, you'll see that the FSF proposed writing to LGA for amendments to the PBBF to recognise the FSF role." Now, the PBBF was the LGA guide. And if we go to the top of this email chain, Ms. Davis, we see Louise Upton replied, "Oh Lordy, let's have a meeting sooner rather than later to see what we can do to steer the FSF away from its worst excesses in respect of control freakery, i.e. the development of a passport scheme. It seems their intervention is not without risk, and we need to think about how we can best manage it." Now, did Louise Upton, Brian Martin or Ken Knight ever speak to you directly regarding the contents of your report?
Not that I am aware, no.
Did anyone from the department ever have a discussion with you, they may not put it as impolitely as that, but about FSF's worst excesses and what they could be referring to here?
No, and I think at that time, going back to what we said earlier, the support issue was around, you know, the idea that we were going to be supported in our work.
And the control freakery, is that an allegation that had been put to you before?
No.
Or dressed up in perhaps more polite language?
Not that I'm aware of, no. I know I'm positive, but...
Were you ever contacted by anyone from the department to discuss the contents of your report?
No.
Did you have any substantive discussions with officials from the department, or indeed ministers, about the proposed amendments for the LGA guide?
No.
Did you ever seek such discussions?
No.
Why not?
I think we were concentrating on trying to move this agenda forward. So I don't think we were at a stage of seeking, certainly, input to ministers.
And certainly if you weren't aware of their...
No, I wasn't aware of this attitude, no.
Now, can we go back to your first statement, which is FSF quadruple 00036/20. And if we could look at paragraph 81, you explain that regrettably no decision was made, possibly because the original review was only 5 persons and this was insufficient to gain a consensus. This meant the process effectively slowed until October 2013. I think this is what you've touched on in earlier answers, that your group had perhaps insufficient critical mass in order to reach a sort of a compelling decision that the executive group would accept. Is that a fair summary?
Yes, it was, but I equally wasn't aware, of course, until I read the minutes, of the feedback from Anthony Maud about the department's reluctance to go forward.
And if we look at paragraph 82 in the same statement, you say that at a competency workshop that was held at IFE headquarters on the 10th of October 2013, it was held to advance the matter. Is that right?
Yes, it was.
Now, if we look at a draft note of that meeting, which can be found at FSF quadruple 00407, we can see from the 4th line at the very top, you attended the meeting. Were any of the others there members of your work stream?
Well, yes, you could say this was the work stream. As I said, that we were organic. If you felt you could contribute, you could attend.
The note is stated to be in draft. Is there any reason to feel that this isn't an accurate summary of the discussion?
No, I think it's accurate. It would have been approved at our next meeting.
Now, what was your plan to build consensus behind the recommendations in your report of April 2013?
I think I was trying to take the feeling of where we were, that we wanted, that the picture that had been given was that we had enough around fire risk assessor competency to go forward, but that the big problem, and this is a rationale logic, the big problem was that the responsible persons were very unaware of their responsibilities and therefore didn't know how and what a competent fire risker might look like. And we really needed to move our attention to, if you like, a communication education process for that group.
Now, if we can turn to the second page of this note, and it's really under the heading of discussion. It says this: significant debate ensued on the approach any new action might take, noting external constraints, such as government's general opposition to regulating business. For example, a suggestion for a signing off regime, while desired, was judged impractical. Continuing austerity and the accepted role in many parts of the fire sector of well-established national accreditation, qualification and self-imposed frameworks that build competency frameworks. Looking at the first of those, why was a signing off regime? First of all, what did it mean?
I think we're back to a mandated scheme.
Why was it considered impractical? Was it just because government was against it?
I think so, and of course there was industry opposition as well.
Now, looking further down this page under the heading Actions, the second line says this: endorse a competency strategy that initially focused upon improving the role and competency of fire safety managers. Now, some of the reasoning for focusing on the narrower question of fire safety competence is set out in the second paragraph under the heading Discussion. But can you give the panel a more detailed understanding of why the focus seems to have narrowed more significantly just onto fire safety managers and not fire risk assessors more generally?
Yes. Well, really, restating what I've been saying, the argument was from the people who were actually doing the work, i.e. the people in the schemes, that the definition from FRAC and the existence of PAS 79 and so on was more than sufficient for a competent fire risk assessor. Competency, I mean, the whole point of competency is knowing what you don't know. Knowing when to stop and seek further advice. And the argument was that that was well enough described by that criteria. and by the methodologies and so on. And therefore, this wasn't an issue around the people who were in those schemes. This was an issue more about the people who had the statutory duty, the responsible person. And therefore, we needed to connect the two.
Now, was a consequence of narrowing the focus onto fire safety managers that the competency criteria and the LGA guide would not require amendment?
Yes, in a way, yes.
And was another consequence that the FSF would not offer guidance on the scope of fire risk assessments, particularly in relation to high-rise residential buildings?
Yes, because the local authority guide existed, yes.
Or how those assessments should be carried out?
Yes.
Now, and that was, all those consequences were accepted, even though there was a specific request from the coroner that the FSF consider fire risk assessor competency.
Yes.
And it was done, those decisions were made in knowledge of the coroner's express recommendation.
Yes, the argument was that there was sufficient information within the criteria for those judgments to be made that an assessor was competent.
And even though the coroner had seen and clearly seen the competency criteria for fire risk assessors and had still considered that further guidance was needed.
Yes, but in the context again, that we were looking at the people within the Fire Sector Federation schemes. So this is one of the problems, that there's a large group of people who call themselves fire risk assessors who are not part of schemes, sole traders, individuals out there who would necessarily not be part of our organisations and would not be part of those schemes.
And I suppose another consequence of this narrowing of the focus, if I can put it like that, was that the Federation did not seek to clarify the scope of fire risk assessments or offer any further guidance on training of fire risk assessors.
Yeah, I think that's a fair summary, because we were pointing, in a way, what we were saying is there is a competent group of fire risk assessors. They're within these schemes.
But again, that decision was made knowing and in full knowledge of the coroner had made recommendations on those topics.
Yes, but the argument was, in this logic, point the responsible person to the people who are competent and away from those who are not competent.
Now, if we could look at the Federation's response to the coroner, that was sent on the 20th of May 2013, and so it's at FSF quadruple 00045, and so this is sent 5 months before the meeting in October 2013, which we've just discussed. Now, take it from me, the letter's signed by Paul Fuller, who was the deputy chairman. Did you help draft the letter, or in any way involved in its drafting?
I'm sure I must have been, either from the minutes that we've talked about or something like that.
Now, if we look at the first page, and really the bottom of this first page, it says this: in the first instance, we are focusing on the immediate questions of competency and effectiveness in carrying out fire risk assessments. Further work will gradually expand the area of Federation scrutiny to include other aspects of concern expressed in the narratives from the jury and the issues highlighted in your summing up. And if we go to the top of the second page, paragraph 1 says this: to date, we have initiated the following actions. 1, formation of a new workstream within the Federation to concentrate on relevant aspects of competency development, accreditation and training in fire safety. This will seek to build on the excellent foundations prepared by the National Fire Risk Assessment Competency Council and to extend that work into the wider aspects of professional competency in fire safety on a principled basis. Yeah. Now, the reference to new workstream is presumably your workstream.
Yes.
Para 2 goes on to say this: the National Social Housing Fire Safety Group, in conjunction with the Fire Protection Association, Chief Fire Officers Association and Skills for Justice, is well advanced in the development of qualifications for fire risk assessors as a basis for the training of housing and estate management staff. These are based upon the national occupational standards in fire safety. We will also review this approach to see if it can be adapted and used as an exemplar and encourage its adoption in other parts of the fire safety sector. Now, what qualifications for fire risk assessors were developed for the training of housing and estate management staff?
I'm not sure, because that work was taken away by another individual to actually get, and they were using the National Occupational Standards, which had been established, I think, as part of the enforcement process.
Was the Federation, did it have any involvement in the development of that particular qualification? Although you may not know about it, do you know whether the Federation had a role in it?
I don't.
Did the Federation review that qualification to see if it could be adapted and used as an exemplar in the context of fire risk assessment?
No, certainly the group I was leading didn't.
Can you explain why you didn't look at that, given the reference in this letter?
No, I can't. I just feel that was probably a piece of work had been taken away by the social housing group to look at it in their context using National Occupational Standards.
Did the Federation work with the National Social Housing Fire Safety Group at all in relation to fire risk assessment?
I had discussions certainly with one or two of their people, but when you say work, I don't think there was any formal work.
Nothing beyond sort of informal chats.
No, and I can remember when I was looking at criteria and so on, discussing things and trying to be helpful and see how that might help them.
Thank you. So I'm slightly mindful of the time. This might be a time for a short break. I am...
You're part way through a topic, or?
I'm part way through, but I think it's...
Yeah, take a break while we can, you mean?
I think so.
Well, there it is, Mr. Davies. We have a break during each session, and this is obviously as good a time as any to take this afternoon's break. We'll stop now. We'll resume, please, at 3:30.
Okay.
And while you're out of the room, please don't talk to anyone about you.
Of course.
All right? Thank you. Thank you. 3:30 then, Mr.
Thanks, sir.
Would you ask Mr. Davis to come back in, please? Yes, right. Please sit down, Mr. Davis. Yes.
Thank you.
I'm sorry we kept you waiting a little longer than I'd indicated, but there we are. We're ready to go on. Are you ready to go on?
Yes, I'm ready to go.
Good. Thank you. Yes, Mr. Clare.
Thanks, sir. Could we now turn to the second letter that the Federation sent to the coroner? And this one was dated the 11th of December 2013. And we can find that at HOM 0004828. This letter was sent 2 months after the October meeting, at which it was decided to focus on fire safety manager competence. It was signed by Brian Robinson. Did you contribute to the draft?
No, I don't think I did.
Did you see it before it was sent?
No.
Now, at the bottom of the first page, the coroner is given an update about the workstream in the following terms. The core competency workstream has continued its work, drawing on contributions from several parties across the sector. There is a clear realisation that this subject underpins all aspects of the fire safety chain we have referred to, extending the scope originally defined by the Fire Risk Assessment Competency Council, applying specifically to fire risk assessments under the Fire Safety Order 2005. It's not wholly clear, but what precise point was the letter seeking to make there?
I'm not that clear myself. No, I'm not. I think it probably reflects that scoping item that we talked about.
Okay.
I think that might be what it's reflecting.
Now, the letter does not say that a decision had been made not to revise the LGA guide. Is that right?
I don't know. Could you?
Well, you can take it from me, it doesn't say that.
Okay.
Do you know why it doesn't say that?
No. No.
The letter does not say that a decision had been made not to revise the competency criteria. Do you know why?
No.
Those were both significant and material omissions about which the coroner should have been informed. Would you agree?
I agree.
Can we now turn to the competency criteria for fire risk managers? Now, first of all, what is a fire risk manager?
Well, it's the person who's responsible within a building for ensuring the maintenance and compliance with the statutory requirements for general fire safety, and that would include the duties of a responsible manager.
Now, there was a meeting of the Fire Risk Management Competency Council on the 14th of April 2014 at the LFB headquarters, which you attended. Can we go to the minutes, which are at FSF 0000550? Now we can see that you attended. You're roughly halfway down, just below halfway down the list of attendees. Now, on the second page, under paragraph 4, there are a series of bullet points described as areas noted by attendees. And if I can just go through them. First, the need for the responsible person to recognise their role as either the fire risk manager or as the person appointing an appropriate, competent fire risk manager. Second, the fact that a person appointed as an FRM may have a plethora of other duties within an organisation. Thirdly, concern over the wide variation in the competency of fire risk managers and that third-party certification was often seen as an unnecessary expense. Fourthly, concern that fire risk assessments were often commissioned on price rather than quality. Fifthly, concern that many organisations were so large and complex that there was little coordination of the disparate elements that comprise the fire safety portfolio. And finally, concern that the needs of those with disabilities were often overlooked in fire safety management. Now, did you share any or all of those concerns at the time of the meeting in April 2014?
Yes, I would have shared most of those.
To the best of your knowledge, were any of those concerns shared with government, either officials or ministers, at the time?
I don't know the answer to that. I'm sorry.
Were these concerns considered more pressing than those relating to fire risk assessor competency?
I think they were, and that was the change in direction.
And hence the focus on
Yes.
fire risk managers. What in particular had happened to cause that focus to shift?
I think going back to what we said previously, that there was sufficient detail around to identify what a competent fire risk assessor would look like, but there was still this concern. And I think one of the works that we did was a matrix of understanding about fire safety amongst duty holders, responsible persons, and this was the sort of concern now being documented.
Now, am I right that the discussion at this meeting in April 2014 led to the publication of the competency criteria for fire risk managers that was published in October 2015?
Yes, I think that was the outcome, yes.
Now, we can go to that document, which is at FSF:000041. Was there a principal author of that document, or was it a collaborative effort?
I think it was. I wasn't directly involved in the collaboration to produce this document, but I think the principal author was a leader from the Fire Brigade Union.
Now, if we look at page 3, we can see under the second paragraph, it says this: the value of a competency standard for fire risk assessors is limited if those in authority, fire risk managers, fail to seek out competent fire risk assessors, if they fail to ensure they themselves have the requisite competencies, if they are undertaking the assessment personally, fail to appoint competent contractors to implement the findings of a fire risk assessment, or fail to examine the quality of fire protection systems. Now, were the specific failings considered here by the Federation considered to be widespread?
Yes, I think so.
And if we go to the 5th paragraph on the same page, the Fire Sector Federation recognised that having established the Competency Council and published competency criteria for fire risk assessors, the next logical step is to consider competency criteria for those actively engaged in fire risk management. Within this, it seems prudent to consider the discipline-specific competencies of those who audit fire risk management systems, including those who may engage in the audit and certification process, should an organisation seek third-party certification of their fire risk management system. Appropriate conformity attestation arrangements are described in BS-EN ISO/IEC 117021. Now, that was a long run-up to a short question. How was this document intended to be used by the responsible person?
It was intended to guide them as to their competency, to assist them make the right selection in terms of carrying out their duties.
If we look at the 6th paragraph on this page, it says this: while it is very unlikely that third-party certification of this nature will become mandatory under legislation, government acknowledges the benefits of third-party certification and is now recognised that this includes fire risk management system certification. Was the content of this document discussed with DCLG, or were they consulted upon its substance?
I don't know, but they would have been aware.
But you weren't directly involved in?
No.
Can you help us? Why was it considered unlikely that third-party certification would become mandatory under legislation?
I think, going back to some of those earlier insights that you provided me, there was a reluctance for any form of additional mandatory controls on business. Red tape, those sorts of arguments were around at the time. And
so irrespective of what trade was actually
I think
saying,
so, yes.
There was that reluctance to regulate.
I mean, fire safety is often perceived as a burden, an addition, and therefore trying to sort of promote it would naturally run you into those sort of arguments.
Did that government reluctance cause you or the group more generally any concern that it would not be able effectively to remedy the widespread failings the document identified in its foreword?
Yes, I think it did. I mean, our concern was that we were producing some guidance, which was quite difficult for us to produce because of limited resource and so on, but that if there wasn't sufficient push and support from government for these things, it became very difficult for it to, A, achieve recognition and support as a necessary requirement in business. So it's a chicken and an egg in one sense. You know, you ask the sector produces guidance, but if there's no promotion of that need, then really the two things, they just exist, but they don't actually promote the thing you're trying to achieve, better fire safety.
And indeed, the objective can be thwarted because there's not effective coordination.
Absolutely.
Can we turn in this document to page 10, and it's Appendix A, which sets out principles and practice of fire risk management. And we see there, if we look at the 6th bullet point, for example, fire risk manager will understand the basic principles of fire protection in buildings, e.g. early warning and means of escape, compartmentation, and fire service access provision. Now, presumably, these requirements here were considered to be both basic, necessary, and desirable. Is that right?
Absolutely, yes. Yes.
Now, who was the intended readership of this document? Was it confined to the responsible persons, or was it hoped that it would attract a broader readership? Broader.
I mean, the responsible person is the person appointed in law, but obviously in a large building or somebody with a big portfolio of buildings, you know, a social landlord, they would appoint other persons to carry out their functionalities. So, you know, just the way you might have an engineer responsible for looking after your energy systems and so on, some would appoint specific people to look after these sorts of responsibilities, the same as you would under the Health and Safety at Work Act, for example.
And how was it intended that these criteria would be published so that not only responsible persons, but the hoped-for broader readership would get hold of them?
I think that's the Achilles heel. One of my concerns, and I voiced this publicly a number of times, is that we were doing a lot of talking to ourselves. You know, we were very informed, but we were talking an awful lot to ourselves. And that initial enthusiasm that you mentioned and the support and so on had waned. And somehow, and I think I saw this not today, but in other commentary in the inquiry, there was almost a sense that we'd become not a problem, but
a burden.
Well, not a burden even, but we had an identified position, and I've heard people in evidence call us a lobbyist, a lobby group or something, and we weren't, you know. I mean, we certainly weren't trying to be that.
Why do you think support waned, and when would you identify, if you can, when that support started to diminish?
I think it was around the fact that expertise in government was reducing, the people, the numbers were reducing. I think there was a background of complacency in one sense, which was drawn out of the fact that fire deaths were pretty stable. Community action programs by the Fire and Rescue Service and so on had a really good effect. There'd been no serious sort of issues arising. So therefore, the perception maybe politically was that fire was under control. The government was reducing, a smaller government, as I mentioned earlier, so an expertise was maybe reducing. So the enthusiasm, the raison d'etre starts to evaporate a little bit.
Now, we're 7 years on, or nearest damn it, from publication of this document. Have you been able to judge how effective the criteria have been in raising standards of knowledge and competency of fire risk managers?
No, we haven't audited, or we haven't got the capacity to do an audit like that.
Do you have any anecdotal sense? If you don't, then please.
The anecdotal sense is one that you would perhaps recognise in other areas. It's that responsible companies, good companies, if I use that general word, do these things and take this sort of information and build it into their systems. But the consequence of that, of course, is you're then trying to say, well, how many are responsible and good and trying very hard to do the right thing, and how many are just
not?
Yes, and that's very difficult to gauge, I would say.
Now, can I turn to a separate topic, which is the BRE report that was commissioned by LFIPA on the 2005 order. Now, if we can go to it, it's LFB 000-46812. You can see from its title page that it's called A Study into the Experience and the Operation of the Regulatory Reform Fire Safety Order 2005 in London, final report, and we can see it's dated the 9th of September 2015. Now, the report was prepared for the London Fire and Emergency Planning Authority by BRE Global. First of all, have you seen this before?
I don't think I have. I don't think so.
It may well have been discussed at a meeting of the FSF Forum in January 2015, when Martin Shipp, who I think was of BRE, said that the BRE had been commissioned by the LFB, and he'd email it, but it doesn't strike you.
I just don't recall it. I mean, I apologise, but I read thousands of documents. It just doesn't jump out at the moment.
Don't worry. Now, if we can go into the report itself, when we go to the bottom of page 85, and it's in a section entitled Recommendations. We can see at the very bottom of the page, emboldened in sort of light blue, is the title Additional Tools or Competencies, and the bullet point reads thus: there is a need for greater emphasis on good management rather than on the form filling of the risk assessment. The risk assessment informs management and is important for auditing, but is not an end in itself. Did you agree with that statement, or would that reflect your views in 2015?
Yeah, I think that's a fair statement.
If we turn over the page and look at the top of page 86, the next bullet point reads as follows: there is a widely held view that a widely recognised and preferable government-endorsed national accredited competency scheme is needed for fire safety risk assessors and fire risk auditors, similar to the gas safe register. Again, would you have agreed with that observation?
Yes.
The relevance of the gas safe register was that it was and remains mandatory, is that right?
Yes. It's back to my MOT.
Do you remember this report prompting any further consideration within the Federation?
I think it renewed my energy with a colleague from the Institution of Fire Engineers.
So you think you did receive this at the time in late 2015?
I possibly did and possibly read it, but I think we were still, I use the expression, gnawing at a bone.
But it doesn't. Just so they can understand, were you aware of the thrust of this report in the last quarter of 2015 or soon thereafter? If you can't say either way.
I can't say either way.
Okay.
Yeah.
Can I turn therefore on to a separate issue, which is the licence to practice proposal that was made in 2016?
Yes.
Now, you prepared a strategy note for the Workstream, which we can find at FSF 0000420. And we can see that at the bottom of the page it's dated the 26th of January 2016 and was co-written with a Neil Gibbons. Who is Neil Gibbons?
He was the acting chief exec at the time of the Institution of Fire Engineers.
Thank you. And if we look at the first and second paragraphs on this page, they say this: a series of 3 meetings between the Workstream leaders for competency and accreditation and workforce development have been held, and the following suggestions and decisions for action have emerged and are placed before members for consideration under the heading Consolidation. Activity in both work streams has not been as anticipated. Initial enthusiasm in issues around competency has wavered, and the workforce development activity has been virtually non-existent. What particular activity had not happened as anticipated?
The workforce work stream hadn't really got going, is the short and long of that.
Through lack of impetus?
Yes, it just didn't get going, yeah.
Why had enthusiasm wavered around the competency and workforce development activity?
I think what's being said here is that we were looking originally discretely in 2 groups: workforce competency, and the fire risk assessment process competency, and you can see that the one affects the other, the workforce.
Can you help us why enthusiasm had wavered? Was it just progress had been more elusive than had originally been hoped and had the knock-on effect of people feeling less enthusiastic?
I think that's a very good way of putting it. It just hadn't happened.
Now, as set out under Decision 1, under the same paragraph, it says that the plan was to develop a new work stream to consolidate competency and accreditation with workforce development. In brief, what was workforce development?
It was about looking at the terms of reference. We're looking about how we developed across the cross-sector interest, not just fire risk assessors, generally, the workforce. It excluded particularly conditions of service, which were seen as outside the remit of the Fire Sector Federation. That was an employer's issue.
And so how would that plan infuse or add impetus to the work streams?
Because that's where training would be done and so on.
Now, turning to the section headed Conceptual Design, which is further down this page, the second paragraph says this: it is suggested that the concept should include a federation-owned licence to practice. The licence effectively would offer recognition across the sector to the public and all commissioners of work that the licence holder is competent to perform appropriate tasks. Can you help us? Why was a federation-owned licence to practice scheme proposed?
Returning to the theme that we couldn't have mandate at the moment, if we could introduce our own scheme, a licence to practice scheme, it would give massive reassurance to the public that they were getting competent people to do their jobs.
And was it intended that fire risk assessors would be called?
Yes, very much so.
It seems in its essence the same as the 2013 passport scheme. Is that a fair observation?
That is a very fair observation.
And it was presumably proposed because you remain concerned about the quality of risk assessments and competency of risk assessors?
Absolutely. I was being persistent.
And had the noise, to use your word, continued over the years in relation to competency of fire risk assessors? Now, if we can go to your first witness statement, which is at FSF /0036/23. And if we look at paragraph 91, and you're answering here a question about the UK fire competency registration scheme, and you explained that the FSF recognised the inherent diversity in the fire sector, challenged cohesion and collaboration, and judged it was unacceptable to have incompetent persons fulfilling key roles that impact directly on fire safety. Who were the incompetent persons fulfilling key roles that impact directly on fire safety?
I was thinking there particularly of fire risk assessors who weren't part of schemes.
How do you address, was there any new thinking about how to address that particular potential regulatory gap?
By forming a register which would require people then to enter into, either voluntary or however it was done if there was no mandate, into a scheme, and to get the market, the users, to recognise that there was a licence to practice, so that they would put pressure from their perspective that the only people who would find that sort of employment would be licensed people.
Now, following on from that, in July 2016, you circulated a further paper which recommended a registration scheme for fire risk assessors. Now, that draft proposal is at FSF /000434. If we look at the second paragraph under the heading Purpose, it said this: this registration scheme is designed to assist all those seeking services within the fire sector to find suitable competent persons. The providers of those services have sought to ensure those registered are credible and competent in the area of work indicated and obligated to avoid poor practice and offer redress in case of dissatisfaction. Now, again, that purpose is basically the same as the scheme you proposed back in April 2013, isn't it?
Yes.
If we go to page 2, we see the following first two paragraphs. 1, schemes determined to have shown suitable standards of quality assurance and professional management may be registered by a 2/3 majority vote of the Council. 2, the standards of acceptance will be determined by the Council and must either meet the UCAS standard or be recognised as of equivalence, providing suitable quality assurance processes. And again, was that intended to apply to fire risk assessors?
Yes.
Is it right that the draft crystallised into a final report, which was circulated in October 2016?
I think that's correct, yes.
And if we can go to that final report, it's at HOM 000-43195. We see it's entitled the UK Fire Competency Registration Scheme. It's dated the 6th of October 2016. You can take it from me, it's signed by you. Were you the principal author?
Yes, I would be.
Now, if we look at the heading background, paragraph 1 says this: last July, a draft competency scheme that proposed to seek to assure the safety of people from fire by ensuring that services registered within the scheme are provided by competent suppliers, and to assist those seeking the supply of services identify competent suppliers, agreed by Competency WG members. What's WG?
Working group.
Working group members, was circulated and feedback has generally been positive. This now raises detailed and difficult matters of asserting quality and implementation, and this note seeks to suggest a process. What precisely did you mean by difficult matters of asserting quality and implementation?
The practicality of establishing a governance, a control mechanism. You're dealing with a diverse group of suppliers. UCAS might be the accreditation body, but the schemes, as we know, there was a...
Who's going to manage it?
Yeah, basically, yes.
So just following on that point, if we turn to page 2, and if we look at the heading implementation, at the head of the page, the report said this: although the process outlined can be debated, the essential underpinning action, if FSF is convinced that users need a simplified access route to competent companies and persons, is for FSF to act positively and start a UK fire sector scheme. Now, first of all, who did you intend to be responsible for administering and implementing the scheme?
I think that was one of the difficult matters that we were talking about managing, because it would need resourcing and so on.
You posed the question, but
yes.
you didn't necessarily have the answer.
I had one in my back pocket.
Which was?
Well, I proposed, I think, in a later document that IFE and BAFE, who were two of the big leaders in this area, would help get the show on the road.
But what were the consequences, though, for fire risk assessors who were not registered under a certification scheme? They would simply be beyond regulation, would they?
Yes, because without a mandate, that could not happen. But at least as a responsible sector, we would have done what we could do to make it happen.
Can you remember now to whom this document was circulated back in October 2016?
It would have gone around the entire Fire Sector Federation.
If you can give the panel the gist of the response it received.
Lots of murmurs. I mean, the problem when these sort of documents go forward to a forum, the principal decision making, or prior to that the executive, there was often a short executive before a forum, so the executive could comment before it, was that it sounded like a good idea, but...
So qualified positive reaction, would that be a fair...
They could see the need, they recognised it probably was a good answer, a good way of dealing with it, but realised there was a lot of probably difficult decisions to be made to try and make it happen.
Did you get any feedback from government?
No.
Can we go to your first statement, which is at FSF *000036/23. And in paragraph 92, you say, following an internal conference between BAFE, IFE, ASFP, who are they?
Association of Specialist Fire Protection Association.
In 2016, the proposal referred to was substituted with a proposal suggesting an online search facility that would allow members of the public to find existing third-party accredited suppliers in the local area through a search. So presumably that meeting was held after the publication of your October 2016 report.
Yes.
Why was and I'm going to put this bluntly, why was your proposal jettisoned in favour of an online search facility?
Because I think primarily there were deep concerns about liability.
Can you flesh out what those concerns might be?
My understanding was that if we operated a scheme such as I was proposing, that if there was then a failure, someone let the side down, then there were certainly responsibilities in law maybe that would attract to the Federation, and the Federation was not really able to manage that sort of responsibility.
And were those concerns regarding potential legal liability, were they the subject of any legal advice, or was it lay people's apprehension of where liability may lie?
The second.
How would an online search facility address the concerns that have been raised about incompetent persons fulfilling key roles that impact directly on fire safety? The problem is they wouldn't, would they?
Well, it's a halfway house.
Is it even that, though?
Well, you would still be at least assisting the public find accredited people under the UCAS schemes and under the IFE register scheme.
But when the concern had been incompetent persons fulfilling key roles, it would do nothing to alleviate that problem, would it?
Well, it would if you were directing them to accredited people. The problem is, without it being widespread and recognised and badges attached to it or however you see it, like gas safe, I think, is the example that most people use, then you had to have a big communication exercise to get the duty holders to understand that it existed.
Now, did you ask for any assistance from government, whether in terms of educating responsible persons and relevant people involved in fire safety, or more pertinently, in respect of money to administer any accreditation scheme that might be proposed?
No. And I think part of the reason for that is it wasn't getting off the ground, and I think we've already covered the point that our support seemed to have been waning.
And the momentum had been lost, in short?
Yes, I think so.
Did the fact that the government have a reluctance to regulate did it inhibit any approaches to government to ask for support, particularly in relation to financial support?
I think you become sensitive to the environment you're in. And in the early days, as you've seen, proposals were made, they were rejected, changed, we altered, kept trying really to improve this situation. But that negativity does feed back. I mean, letters had been written on other subjects, we haven't touched on them here, building regs and so on. And that there was a sort of a negativity existing. So that does create that sort of environment, yes.
Could we go to the next document I'd like to discuss with you, which is a FSF quadruple 0440. It's another one of your reports, Mr. Davis. You prepared this in May 2017, I think. And the first paragraph you write this: I am unaware of any progress following last December's BAFE, IFE, ASFP, FPA telephone conference agreement to create an online search capability to find existing third-party accredited suppliers, an amendment of the competency strategy. It is, however, suggested to members that they met to consider developing a curriculum to support competency criteria. The criterion process would follow the successful approach used to establish the Fire Risk Assessors Competency Council. Why had no progress been made between December 2016 and May 2017?
I think for the reason I said before, primarily a reluctance and a concern around liability.
And what benefits would a curriculum have brought as opposed to, frankly, a register?
I was trying to refresh. We were a few years on now from FRACs being developed. 2011 was the original FRACs. So it was a question of looking at these things again.
Did you think, to what extent could FRAC be said to have been successful, given that there were persisting concerns regarding the competency of fire risk assessors?
I think FRACs was very successful, and in fact, when we updated the documents as we did subsequently in 2018 and so on, post Grenfell Tower fire, FRACs was still seen as an important relative document. So it had, I think, spawned work, There were certification bodies under the regulatory qualifications framework who were starting to look at levels of assessments. That's just the certificate. The problem with competency is you're looking at skills, experience, behaviour and knowledge, and a certificate often only gives you the knowledge component. So, but it had started to spawn that sort of effort, so it was successful in developing the profession.
Now, could we turn to your second witness statement, which is at FSF quadruple 0552, and if we go to page 4, paragraph 21. And you explain there in the first line that a separate page of advice and information regarding fire risk assessment was created on the Fire Sector Federation website. And this includes, from February 2021, a national listing of fire risk assessors drawn from established professional registers. Now, what professional registers feature on that website?
IFE, the UCAS schemes, the Warrington, which is Warrington and BAFE, the ISFM.
Given that the proposal was first made in December 2016, why did it take nearly 5 years to implement?
Because I think of the reluctance and the concerns going through.
Did government help in any way, funding or any other resource? No. Was government help asked for?
No.
How is the website funded?
We just do it, the Federation.
And you manage and update the website?
Personally, yes.
Have you received any feedback or conducted any review as to the effectiveness of this website resource in addressing the problems that you've consistently identified since 2010, if not before?
It's used, and I can measure that, a degree of that from the number of visits.
But it only goes so far.
Yes.
In resolving the issue of competence.
Yes, it does.
Could I turn to the next topic, which is a Home Office request that was sent in February 2017? And if we can start with CLG 000 19385. And if we see at the bottom of this page, there is an email from Louise Upton regarding a Federation meeting on the 9th of February 2017. You didn't attend that meeting, take it from me. If we look at page 2, the second bullet point in the email says as follows: the FSF think the FSO guidance is inadequate and plan to write to the Home Office with the offer to take on the task of revising it. Was there a concern within the Federation at the time regarding the adequacy or sufficiency of the FSO guidance?
I'm really having to think about that because I'm not too sure which guidance she's referring to.
But do you remember any concerns about the advice that was published by government regarding the order and how best to comply?
Certainly the DCL guides, certainly the simple premise guides. I think people still regarded them as satisfactory.
You don't remember, certainly you weren't involved in the making of any offer to take on the task of revising guidance?
No. Not that I'm aware of, no.
Final topic I'd like to discuss with you today is other sort of actions arising from LACNOR. And if we go back to the FSF's reply to the Coroner, which is at FSF quadruple 0045, and if we can look at the third bullet point on page 2, that discusses working with the department to consider how the Federation can provide support in the review and possible amendment of approved document B. Do you know whether any work was done by the Federation to assist the department in those respects?
I think I mentioned at the beginning that the relationship between a fire risk assessor who is inside the building primarily and the outside of the building, the construction of the building, is a very, very important one. And the outside, the structure of the building, the arrangements, rest really with the building regulations. And we were really concerned that the regulations were getting completely out of date. I mean, really concerned, to the point, and I think you covered this yesterday maybe, or even, we were about to launch a really major campaign about updating the building regulations ADB. We were deeply concerned that it was getting beyond a joke. It was really falling so far behind.
Do you know who had responsibility for that work at the Federation? Was it you or was it someone else?
Oh no, it wasn't me. It was Tom Roach, I think, led the built environment workstream. Yes.
Now, if we look at the fourth bullet point, which is at the bottom of this page, can you assist us with the awareness and publicity programme seeking to raise the profile of fire safety that was to be or had been undertaken by the Federation? What's been talked about there?
Well, we did have we did have a press media part-timer who assisted us, and I think what we were trying to do was to try and push forward this idea of getting this profile really out there, because I've mentioned complacency and the fact that people were not paying sufficient attention to fire safety, and that sense was one of foreboding. You know, I mean, a lot of people were getting very concerned at fires that were happening, of things that didn't seem to be connecting, that the fact that the regulations were difficult to interpret. I seem to remember one of the documents I glanced at, 45 ways of improving just the language of the ADB. So it was all about that, and it was just, you remember I said we were doing a lot of talking to ourselves. I think we'd reached the point of, this has really got to go out. You know, we've really got to start to engage a much wider group, because no one is listening. Our principal route to try and get messages through had been right through the APG. That was one of our main connections. We were the technical advisors. Brian Robinson, people like that, were the technical advisors. So when we couldn't advance with officials, you end up politicising the process to at least try and make something happen. And I think this was all part of that process.
Now, turning over the page to page 3, there's a reference there to the Fenestration self-assessment scheme and the importance of checking fire safety requirements when replacing windows. That paragraph says that the Federation had been in touch with the Glass and Glazing Federation in respect of that scheme. Can you help with what work had been done by the Federation on that point?
No, I can't, but one of the members of that, if you remember, of the major workstream looking at Lacanau, was Mike Wood. Mike Wood was very much involved with glazing and therefore had taken those messages into that organisation. One of the, being a volunteer organisation, one of the things that happened when it sometimes looks as though nothing's happening is 2 or 3 interested people would take something on and go away and do it, and that's why you didn't seem to get progress for maybe a couple of 3 months. Then they'd bring something back that they'd actually progressed.
Thank you. Mr. Davis, I've reached the end of my prepared questions. Sir, may I have 10 minutes or so to see if there's anything I've missed out, or see whether anyone has anything else to suggest?
Of course. Well, Mr. Davis, the Council says he's reached the end of his questions, but at this stage we always have a short break to give him a chance to check whether that's really the case, and also to give other people who are following our proceedings but not from this room to suggest questions that possibly we ought to put to you. So we'll break now and we'll come back at 4:30. That should be enough time, shouldn't it?
I think so.
We'll come back at 4:30 and then we'll see if there are any more questions for you then.
Thank you very much.
All right? So would you like to give the usher, please? Yeah. Half past 4 then, please.
Thanks, sir.
Thank you. Would you ask Mr. Davis to come back in, please? Thank you. Yes, please sit down, Mr. Davis. Right, well, we'll see if there are any more questions for you.
Okay.
Yes, Mr. Kinnear?
I have no further questions,
Oh.
so it leaves me to say thank you very much for attending. Much appreciated.
Oh, thank you.
Well, Mr. Davis, thank you very much indeed for coming. I say it on behalf of all three of us. I think we've all found it very interesting to get your insight into what was going on and the proposals you were making. And so although you haven't been here too long, I'm glad to say it has been very helpful to us, and we're very grateful to you
thank
for
you.
coming.
May I just say
Of course.
that I really support what you're doing. We, in the Federation, really feel bad about this.
Yeah. Well, I understand. That's
And
very...
I think, going forward, a note of caution as well. It's very easy to see these things as black and white, but it's a judgmental process that we're talking about. And I would just worry that fire risk assessment becomes so absolute that we lose sight of the fact that human beings are involved in having to reach judgments. I also worry that our emphasis on preventing a catastrophe, which we must do, must also ride into and cascade into general fire safety in all sorts of buildings, not just high-rise residential. And that to me is very, very important, because whatever happens going forward, I just wish we'd been able to get that message across better and get better government support. I have to say, in the last year or so, the amount of support coming from government has been a lot more positive. I'm engaged in something at the moment which may involve actually bringing on a scheme to deal with a wider group of fire risk assessors. And the government has responded most positively to that at the moment. So I just hope and fear that we don't go back into that sort of reluctance to engage, which really, I think, contributed so much to the loss of those 72 people.
Well, thank you, and it's good to hear that things are looking a bit more positive now. It's, as you say, a pity that perhaps a similar approach wasn't taken earlier on, but anyway.
Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kinnear. Well, that must be it for today. And we shall be back on Monday of next week.
We will, where we'll hear from Louise Upton.
Yes, good. Well, we'll look forward to that. So that's it for the day. 10 o'clock on Monday of next week, then.
Thanks, sir.
Thank you very much.